We've been working our way through Genesis, and we've been talking about some of the real heroes in the Old Testament, guys like Noah and Abraham, and then last week we talked about Jacob. Long time ago, when we were getting ready to have our first child, Julia and I thought Jacob would be a cool name for a boy. I remember fighting for it for all 9 months, and the reason was because in the Bible, I just always thought he's an interesting character. He's, in fact, probably my favorite character in the Old Testament, mostly just because why would God pick a guy like this? It just seems like everything about his life is a mess, and yet God chooses him, and God has this plan for him, and God really has a thought for Jacob. And I would tell Julia that, why do you want to name him after somebody whose life was a mess? And well, it's not that, and I just think it's cool. And we would argue about it. And I don't know why she hated the name so bad. Maybe had an ex-boyfriend or something. But I remember there being a battle. We just couldn't get. We disagreed with it the whole 9 months about what we were going to name our child. And then we had a girl, so it didn't matter anyway. But I remember fighting about it. What really did me in was there was a country song that came out about the same time we were having our little girl, and it was about a dog. And if I should die before I wake, feed Jake. Now, how many of you remember this song? Okay, yeah, the Rednecks. Anyway, but that was the song, and I think that's what did me in. I think if it hadn't been for that song, I had an outside chance. But when that song came out, well, that was that, and we just didn't do it. And then by the time we had a son, years later, I'd already moved on, and the argument was over. But I remember it being a battle there. And the reason is because Jacob meant such a big deal to me just studying about him, because God speaks to about Jacob while he's in the womb, that I'm going to bless him. And the prophets later on remembered that story, and they would say things like, God declared Esau I hated and Jacob I loved, which is not exactly what was going on, but it was a passion, right? That God chooses Jacob before there's any reason to choose him. And then even when Jacob comes along, he kind of proves himself a mess. He lies and cheats and in fact eventually will so aggravate his family that in Genesis 28 they say to him, maybe it's best if you leave. Now, first of all, kind of picture that in your head. What would have to go on in a family before all the family gets together and says, hey, you know what, maybe it'd be better if you just left. I mean, how you'd have to wreck a lot of deals. And it doesn't tell us how old Jacob is there, but you can do some calculations, and if anybody's interested in this, it takes about 3 minutes to explain it, so I'm not going to do it in the sermon, but you can calculate how old Jacob was in this moment. In my head, I'd always kind of pictured him 20s or 30s, but Jacob is closer to 70 at this point. I mean, now I don't know if they counted their years the same way we do, because he's still very much physically in the prime of his life. He's after this story we tell today, last week he lied to his brother, and now they've asked him to leave. And after this story, he's going to work for 20 years as a farmhand. So I mean, he's still physically pretty much in the prime of life. But so I don't know if they counted their years different, or people age different there, or what was going on. But he's 70, and I will say, by the age of 70, you pretty much are who you're going to be. Maybe at 20 there's some hope of bringing you around, but at 70. Well, there's even an American proverb about this, that you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? And some of you guys are sitting by old dogs this morning, and you know what I'm talking about, that there's just no way, if a person gets to a certain age, and they pretty much are who they are. And Jacob is pretty much who he is at this point. And his family, taking a hard look at him, say, you know what, maybe it'd be better if you just moved on, at least for a while. Give us a break. And they send him to some cousins who are like 500, almost 600 miles away. And that's where the story this week pops up. And I'm just going to tell you the story, and then we'll see if we can't pull some meaning out of it after it's over. It says Jacob left Beersheba. That's where his father Isaac had been. That's where Abraham had settled down, was in Beersheba. He left Beersheba, and he set out for Haran, which, like I said, 500 miles, 600 miles. And when he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set, and he took one of the stones there, and he put it under his head, and he lay down to sleep. Now, you could read this a couple different ways. You could read it that he's just a really tough guy, like sleeping on the rocks, and that may be part of it. But it really hasn't painted him that way so far in the story. You could paint it like he's poor, like he's got no money to stay with somebody, and that mom and dad have kicked him out and left him with. And that's possible too, but I don't know that either if that's it. But what you can say for sure is it's lonesome, right? He's made everybody he cares about so mad at him that they want to move on. And he's all by himself, and he's camping out for the night, and he's sleeping on a rock, and he has this dream. And in the dream, there's a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching into heaven, and the angels of God are ascending and descending on it. And all this is kind of important. The stairway shows there's a connection to God, right? And that Jacob is still connected to God. And I'm not even sure Jacob really believes in God at this point. I mean, not really, but there's a connection to God, a stairway to heaven that God is always paying attention. And this ascending and descending, the angels are coming up and down, like God is doing business on earth. And the song we sang, even when I don't see it, you're moving. Even when I don't feel it, you're moving. You're moving all the time. God is moving and making things happen. And you might not be aware of it, but it doesn't mean God's not doing it. And that's what this dream's about. He's asleep there on his rock, and he can see God on a stairway to heaven, and angels are coming back and forth, and God's at the very top of the stairs. And he starts to speak. He says, I'm the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac, and I will give you and your descendants this land on which you're lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, he says. And you'll be spread out to the east and the west and the south and the north. And all people on earth can be blessed because of you and your offspring. Now, he had given Abraham almost this same promise, word for word. Abraham, he took out at one night and said, look up at the stars. And you can just count them, so skyline to skyline, stars everywhere. And he says that's what your family is going to be like. It's just going to be just 1,000 generations of kids, and one of those stars, one of your descendants is going to bless the whole world. And as Christians, we think that's Jesus. Jesus was a descendant of Abraham, and that one day he came along and he was the blessing to the whole world. And this was the promise of God right from the very beginning, first book of the Bible. And he makes that promise to Jacob. You're the one I've chosen to be the guy. And he doesn't use stars in this. He says it's like the dust of the earth, and Jacob's laying in the dust. He says if you could look at each speck, that's how many kids you're going to have, and kids and grandkids, and you're going to be a nation all unto yourself, and I'm going to bless the whole world through you. And then he says, and I'm going to be with you. Well, I'm just going to be, I am. I am with you. And I'm going to watch over you wherever you go, and I'll bring you back to this land, and I will not leave you, he says, till I've done what I promised. Now, of all the things that he says, this is the most powerful, at least for Jacob personally. I'm with you. You know, your whole life has been spinning kind of out of control, but I'm with you, he says. And it doesn't have to continue to spin out of control. He says, you can come back to me. We can be tied together. That's the whole dream about the stairway to heaven. We're on the same side, and I'm with you. And he's going to leave, Jacob is, and go to this Haran, and he's going to spend 20 years there, and his life there is going to be up and down, but God never quits on him. And God never stops on him, and God never gives up. And this idea of bringing you back to this land must seem like an impossible dream to Jacob at this point, because everybody hates him there. But God says, I'll do it. I'll do it, and I will absolutely be with you the whole time. My presence is going to hover over your life. And what he's given Jacob here is purpose, right? Your whole life has been chaos till now, but I'm offering you a life of purpose. There's a reason why you're here, and we're you and me, God says, we're on the same thing. We're trying to change this world, and you can be part of what I do and bless the whole world. And it must have seemed almost fantastic to him. And so when Jacob awoke, he says, surely the Lord's in this place. And I had no idea. Even when I don't see it, you're working. And even when I don't feel it, you're working. Now, Jacob kind of misunderstands, I think. He thinks that the place he's at must really be holy. And you think about some time in your life where you went to a mountaintop or a beach, and you're there on the ocean or some really pretty place, and you stand there and you feel so small in a great big world, and your heart's drawn to God. or some church service or camp meeting or revival or whatever, and it just hits you and you feel like God's watching, and in that moment you say, what a holy place this is, you know, as if the place is the thing. But it's not the place, it's you. But Jacob doesn't get it. He says, surely God was in this place. And he was afraid. And he says, how awesome is this place? The King James says, how dreadful is this place? This is none other than the house of God. You know, this place that I'm at, where this stairway to heaven comes, what an awesome thing. Boy, I'm so glad I got to be here for a minute. And early the next morning, Jacob took the stone that he'd had under his head, and he stands it up, and he puts oil on it, and he renames the place Bethel, which means house of God. He names it for the vision that he had. It used to be called Luz, he said, but he names it Bethel. And then he makes this vow to God. And he says, if, and the if word's a very important word. He says, if God will be with me. And by the way, he's not even talking to God when he says this here. He's just talking in general to the cosmos, right? It's not a prayer. He says, he makes a vow to himself, basically, and says, if God's with me, if God watches over me on this journey I'm taking, and he gives me food to eat and clothes to wear, if God does, and by the way, Mike, there's a little side note here. Mike mentioned that sometimes you read a verse 2 or 3 times and it hits you, first time ever hits you. And this one kind of hit me studying for it this week. Jesus later on will preach a sermon where he'll say, why do you worry like pagans about your food? Doesn't God feed the birds? And why do you worry like pagans about clothes? Doesn't God clothe the grass of the field and the flowers? He says, pagans run after all these things, but you seek God first. And I wonder if when Jesus was tying that together with the clothes and the food, if he was thinking of this story. And it would make sense if he was, because Jacob is being challenged to seek God, but his mind's not on seeking God at all. His mind is on food and clothes. So if God, you get me back, and I have enough food, and I have enough clothes, and you get me back, if God does all that, okay, he says, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone I've set up will be God's house, and whatever he gives me, I'll give some back. If God does that for me, then I'm gonna tithe. I'm gonna be a guy who follows God. God comes through for me, I'm gonna come through for God. And that's the story. And Jacob's not really close to God yet. He's not. He's still very holding God off at arm's distance. Jacob's still not really convinced God's going to come through. God might not, he says. But if he does, then that'll convince me. I'll be 100% at that point, and I'll really be good. Now, we won't tell this story here today, but 20 years later, when he finally does come back, and God kind of sets all that up, and he comes back, and he has made his cousins 500 miles away, he's made them also mad. They've got an army up to chase him when he's coming back into Israel. So he has an effect. He has an effect on people. But he's coming back, and there's a scene where he gets in a wrestling match with an angel, and it's like he's wrestling with God. And that's Jacob's whole life. He's just wrestling with God. And at the end of it, the angel kind of breaks him, and he surrenders completely. And Jacob will eventually come back, and he will become this guy that God wants. But it really is because God's pursuing. God never lets up, and God has a plan, and God won't be denied. Jacob is the hero, but he's the hero because God makes him the hero, and that's why I think he's interesting. I think he's just a fascinating character all the way through. And if your name is Jacob, I'm on your side. One person named Jacob this morning, talked to him after the service, and he said, I had no idea there was a dog song about me. It's a great one, too. Look on that up on iTunes. I don't remember who sang that one, but it's a great song. Okay, anyway, lessons from the deal. What lessons can we draw from that story? Well, there's 2 or 3. First one is this. God choosing you has nothing to do with what you bring to the table. That's the first lesson. God choosing you has nothing to do with what you bring to the table. You may be the most talented or the smartest or dad's favorite, or you may not be any of those things. You may not have much talent, or you may wonder what you can do or can't do, and you're in your late life and still not sure what you're going to do with yourself. Or maybe you've made everybody mad enough they wished you'd move on and done it more than once. It happens. But God choosing you has nothing to do with any of those things. And there's an encouragement in that. That makes me feel good. because I can look back at my life and see different ways where maybe I could have done different, and God never quits on me because of those kinds of things. That's powerful, and I think it's a thing we want to hang on to real tight as we move forward. Second, God is moving all the time. Angels ascending and descending, a stairway to heaven that connects us, and we just aren't aware of it. We just don't notice. God is moving all the time. I've talked about this before in sermons, that sometimes you live your life and you think back about your life and how you got to this point, and it reads like a novel. You can see at every turn where God was moving, but in the moment it just feels like chaos. And yet hopefully, after you've walked with God for just a little bit of time at all, you can see His hand. I mean, I look back at some of the stuff in my past where I would pray most hard for God to fix things. God, I can't do this anymore. God, you gotta come in. You got to straighten this up. You got to take care of this other person. You got to help me know what to do. And you'd pray those kinds of prayers and just be so frustrated because whoever you were dealing with in your mind was so out of bounds. And even now, thinking about some of those villains in my past, I still see some of them as villains. I do. I mean, it's not like I've gotten to this place of maturity where I no longer do that. I wish I was, but I'm not. But I can see how God used even those moments where it was kind of hard and where it was conflict and where I felt like I was getting mistreated, and God's used even those things to bring me along, and God's always moving. I believe, and I don't want to dig too deep into this because it can take you down some weird paths, but I believe that God even uses my bad decisions to help me figure things out. Even sometimes when I go the wrong direction, and it's sin, I don't think God chooses the sin for me. I don't think God wants me to go that way, but I think God can take even those things and use them. I think about especially one of the hard parts about coming back to this area. I grew up in Paoli, and that was my hometown. Go Rams. Anyway, but I was down there in Paoli, and I remember being worried about coming back, that there might be people who remember me from school, and what would they think? Because was I different then, and how much different? And did I say something stupid then? And I was a kid, so I'm sure I did. And then to come back to this area and to try to be, and for the most part, I've met a few people who remember me from before, and for the most part, God has even used that. You know, God has used it partly to show how He's always moving and how He can change somebody. And for that, I'm grateful. So I think that's a lesson you can pull out of this. Jacob finds that out, and I have found that out. Another thing we find out is that you can't bargain with God. Now, Jacob tries to. God says, I want you to do this. And Jacob says, well, let's just see if you come through first, God. If you come through first, then I'll do it. And God really doesn't do that. God lays out what He wants you to do, and you either take it or leave it. But God doesn't really bargain. And now, ironically, there's lots of stories about the devil bargaining. There's lots of stories that we tell about the devil bargaining. Faust is a really old one where the devil makes a deal, and that was kind of rewritten to the Devil and Daniel Webster. There's been some movies like Bedazzled or Bedeviled or something, really back when I was a kid, where the devil makes a deal. One of the old God movies, the devil makes a deal. Charlie Daniels sang a song about the devil offering you a gold fiddle for your soul, and it made a lot of money. The Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? There's a guy in that movie who sells his soul to the devil, or thinks he does, so he can play guitar really good. And that's supposed to be based on a real life story where a guy named Robert Johnson said he made a deal with the devil. And he made a deal with the devil, and he could play guitar real good, but the devil got his soul. And I don't think the devil really does that. I don't think he does. There's been times where I wondered if Bill Belichick maybe had sold his soul to the devil, because it seemed like he was always getting the lucky end of things, but then here lately, I don't think that as much as I used to. But at the time, I really used to wonder about it. Could a person do that? You know, make a deal with the devil. You know, give me this, and then I don't care what happens afterward. And I don't know if the devil really does that, but it's curious that there's a lot of stories like that. There's a lot of folk stories, and then even in modern day stories where the devil makes deals with people. But God never does that. It's a kind of a take it or leave it thing with God. There's a guy named Gideon. And God appears to Gideon and says, I want you to be my general. Gideon says, I'm a coward. I can't be a general. But God won't quit on him. Oh, yeah, you can do it. You're my guy. And so finally Gideon agrees to do it, though he doesn't think he'll do a good job. And he recruits an army. They're going to fight an army of 120,000. And Gideon does all the recruiting he can do. He finds 32,000 guys who'll help him fight an army of 120,000. And God says, you got too many. So Gideon says, okay, anybody who's scared can go home, and 2/3 of them go home. And God says, you've got too many. And so Gideon whittles them down again. And finally he has 300 people, and God says, okay, we can work with 300. And Gideon, he's just scared to death. He's just scared to death. And the night before they attack, he tells Gideon, if you're still scared, sneak down there to the camp and listen in. So Gideon sneaks down to the camp of the enemy, and he listens in. Then he hears two guys talking, and one guy says, I had a dream. This big roll of barley rolled off the hill and crushed a tent. And the other guy says, oh, that barley, that sounds like that's Gideon. He's going to give the whole camp. God's already promised. And the enemy's talking about him. And so Gideon's, okay, God, now I'm convinced. And so he goes and he fights this big battle, and he does this big thing, and it's got to be on God's terms. He won't let Gideon come in strong. He's got to come in weak. And he won't let Gideon do the things that Gideon wants to do. It's got to be the way God wants to do it. And you see that over and over and over and over and over and over and over again in Scripture, that God won't let you bargain with him. It's either his way or no way. You know, that's still true for us today. And God may not ask you to lead an army, probably won't in America in 2024. God's probably not going to ask you to take over land like he does with Jacob in this story we just read. But he will ask you to do things. And some of the things he asks you to do sound impossibly hard. And you might wonder if God can be trusted. But God really won't negotiate on that thing. I had a friend who's an addict. He's an alcoholic and just drank and drank so much of that poison that the doctor finally had an appointment. The doctor says, you keep doing this, you're going to die, and you're going to die soon. It won't be long. You're going to die. You're tearing the lining of yourself. You're going to die, and it's going to be very fast. And he said, I went out to my truck, and I was so scared I drank a whole fifth of whiskey thinking about it. Just because he couldn't get it out. And he said, and I asked him, well, what was going on? Well, I knew what God wanted, he said. I knew what God was telling me to do. I mean, the doctors agree. I mean, I knew what God wanted, but I believed that if I quit drinking, I'd die. I believed I couldn't function without it. And I knew what God wanted. I just didn't trust that he'd be with me, that I'd make it. I just didn't seem like it would work. And God says, I'm with you. And I will be with you. But we got to do it on my terms. And God really won't negotiate those terms. God might be asking you to forgive somebody, and when you look at them, you just boil all over again. Be a cold day in hell for I forgive that, you say. And God will have to forgive me and move on because I'm not doing it. And God won't just move on. That's not how God operates. You can't bargain with God. God might be asking you to show grace to somebody who's hard to show grace to. God might be asking you to share something that's so hard to share. You're just scared if you lose part of it, it'll be too much. God might be asking you to step up or to speak. Take a chance. This week, Josh had his kids over here at church, and he was tossing one of the kids into this giant beanbag. It's up in the youth room, and one of the kids liked it a lot, and the other kid wanted nothing to do with it. And he was hoping they'd all like it. You know, well, how much fun it is, throw you through the air, and one kid shaking his head. And I remember when my kids were young like that, and being in the pool and trying to get one to jump, you know. And she's scared. And she's all covered up with floaties. I mean, she couldn't drown if she wanted to. I couldn't push her under the water but she doesn't know that. And I'll catch you, you know, but I might get water up my nose. I might drown. No, you're not going to drown, you know. I'll catch you. But I can't make her. Sometimes you'd be tempted to just grab her and make her do it. But if you grab her and make her do it, then she doesn't learn anything. So you just got to wait and see if she'll do it or not. And if she doesn't do it, then she's never going to know what it means to trust me. She's never going to fly. So you hope she'll trust you. Boy, it's painful to watch. And I think God does that with us. And I know it's scary sometimes to let go of the thing that you're holding on so tight that God wants you to let go of. Or that you're not jumping into it like he wants you to jump in, and you know what his will is. You know what his will is. You know what he wants you to do, you just don't know if you can, or if you should, or if he's going to be there if you do. And so you don't. You never really find out what it's like to trust him. And you never learn what it's like to fly. When I was in high school, just out of high school, just graduated high school, this movie came out called The Bear. And there's not a lot of talking in The Bear, but it's still a pretty good movie. It wasn't super popular then, and it's kind of faded out of the public imagination. But it was a great movie, and it's about this little bear cub, and his mother is killed in the hunters, like a Bambi kind of thing. It's all real life pictures, so it's not cartoon. And the bear cub's all by himself, and this great big Kodiak bear kind of adopts him. This big male Kodiak kind of takes the cub in and adopts him, which is not normally how nature works. Normally in nature, the big Kodiak bear eats the little cub, which would not be nearly as good a movie. But in the movie, he adopts him, takes the little cub in, and there's a mountain lion that saw the mother die, and the mountain lion's swooping in to get the little cub, but then when the big Kodiak pops up, the mountain lion takes off, and the Kodiak starts teaching the little cub how to be a bear. And he teaches the bear how to roar. There's like a scene where the little bear trying to make him roar, and he gets up on his feet, and the little bear tries to do that. And there's a scene where he's scratching his back, the big bear on the tree, and the little bear's trying to do that too. And the mountain lion's always off in the distance. You'll get little glimpses of the mountain lion kind of keeping an eye on things, but it doesn't want no part of that big bear. Well, at the end of the movie, they get separated. And the little bear's out by a cliff and kind of playing around, and the mountain lion swoops in. Sees its chance. Little bear sees the mountain lion at a distance and starts running hard as it can to the other direction. Gets on this big limb above the river, and the mountain lion starts going out, and the limb breaks, and the bear's in the river, and the lion's going around. It's real tense. And then finally the mountain lion gets to where the bear can't move. There's a waterfall on one side, and there's the lion right there, and swipes at the bear and bloodies his nose, and it looks like everything's over for the little bear. And so the little bear does what he's been taught to do. He kind of rears back and it's a little bitty roar, and the mountain lion's not convinced, and you're worried you're going to see nature take its course here, and the lion takes one step forward, and then the little bear does it again, and the mountain lion's face, fear registers, and it backs up and takes off, and then the camera pans out, and there's the big bear behind the little bear. Big paws, giant growl, and the mountain lion. And that's God, right? And we're worried that we're going to be out of his hand. And he never leaves us. He doesn't forsake us. Big paws, giant growl. And it's scary to jump out there and let him catch you and to do what he asks you to do. But God won't bargain. And I think if you pick up any part of this story, that's one of the lessons you want to pick up. Well, that and this last thing, that there's a stairway to God. Now, Jesus picks up on this language in the New Testament. Jesus is telling a story in the New Testament. We're introduced in John 1 to a guy named Philip. He's one of the disciples. And Philip finds a guy named Nathaniel who will be a disciple. And he tells him, we found the one who Moses wrote about in the law, the one about who the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph. And Nathaniel says, Nazareth, can anything good come from there? As how you might talk about Paoli. Paoli? Ha! Anything good come out of Tunnelton, Needmore, whatever. Whatever little part of the county, And all this stuff that he says in the first thing here. We found the one. Moses and the prophets, this Jesus, but he's from Nazareth. Oh, Nazareth. Ha! Not believing in Nazareth, I don't think he's the right guy for me. And Philip said, well, come see. So while they're on their way, Jesus sees Nathanael coming up. And he says, oh, here's an Israelite of who there's no deceit. And Nathanael, how do you know me? Or you think you know me? Is kind of the gist of it. How do you know me? Nathanael said. And Jesus says, I saw you when you was under the tree, when Philip called you. I've always been with you. I won't leave you. I won't forsake you. I've always been right on the edge. I saw you even before you saw me, Jesus says. And Nathanael says, Rabbi, you're the Son of God. You're the King of Israel. And Jesus says, you believe because of that? Because of what me just saying about the tree? You're going to see greater things than that. And then Jesus tosses this line out. He's then added, he says, very truly, I tell you, you're going to see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Jesus says, I'm Jacob's ladder. I'm Jacob's ladder. And any one of you can come to God through me. And it's not tied to a place. It's just tied to God's invitation to you. And any one of you can walk up the ladder whenever you want to. And really, no matter how your life has gone, I doubt that there's anybody in here who their family has said, leave us alone. We're all better off without you. But there might be one or two. I'm confident in a room this size that somebody's heard that before. There's an ex-wife or ex-husband or some kid who's made you your kid finally got so mad, you know what, I'm on my own. Let's not talk anymore. I mean, I know in a room this size, there's people in here who have so disappointed the people they live with, that the people they live with decided it'd be better off for us if we weren't together anymore. I'm sure that's happened, right? Because that's life. But God has never forgotten you. Even in that awful moment, he's never stopped. He sees you. He has asked you to trust him. At the end of the service, we'll have a minute here where we're going to sing a song and think about Jesus coming back again. And during all that, we want to challenge you if anybody here needs God's presence in their life, right? For God to come and move in them. You know, God, you promise not to be distant. I need to see you, God. I need to feel you. I want to know you're around. I want to commit. We want to give you a chance here at the end of the service to do just that. And to call out to God and to ask God to move with the assurance that he will. Jesus is Jacob's ladder. And he'll pull you up close to God if you ask him to. So let's pray.